Okay. So, and then slideshow, right? Okay, welcome everybody. It is my honor to have visiting us today, Dr. Meseret Helou. So she'll be giving a talk on understanding gender in higher education in African universities. Dr. Meseret Helou is an assistant professor of higher and secondary education at Arizona State University. She is exploring two lines of research concerning the experience of undergraduate Black women in different geographic settings, East Africa and the United States. Her primary research agenda investigates how articulations of identity shape education retention and reflect institutional culture. Methodologically, Dr. Helou approaches her work through mixed methods, specializing in qualitative research. Her work has been published in top-tier journals, including Comparative Education Review, Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, and Research in Higher Education. Additionally, she's received funding from the National Academy of Education, Spencer Foundation, the Fulbright Program, the National Science Foundation, and the United States Agency for International Development. Prior to coming to Arizona State, Dr. Helou was a postdoctoral research associate at the Ohio State University, where she studied the experience of women of color, faculty and engineering departments. She received her PhD from the Mortgage College of Education at the University of Denver, a MS from Regis University, and a BSVA from the University of Denver. So, Meseret, it's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to click in likewise, and then people online, let us know if you cannot hear me at any point. Cool. So thank you everyone for coming. As mentioned, my name is Meseret Helou, and I'm so happy to be here. And I really appreciate everyone who came both in person and online, because I am hearing that today's a very busy day for all of you. So thank you for making time for me. As mentioned, I came from Arizona State University, where I work as an assistant professor of higher and post-secondary education. I arrived in Scotland yesterday after spending about 10 days in London for a study abroad course that I was teaching. And it's really beautiful, and I've really enjoyed being here thus far. This is my fifth year at ASU. And so if you have any questions about the institution or want to learn more about that aspect of my work, I'm happy to engage in a Q&A later about that as well. So today, as mentioned, I'll be doing a presentation. I'll be presenting about how to understand gender and higher education in African universities, a critical discourse analysis of key policy mandates. And in terms of my outline for today's presentation, I'll tell you a little bit more about study background and the research team that's involved in this work. And then I will discuss some of the methods we used. I'll share some of the findings, and then discuss implications for practice and research, including the next steps I plan to take, and how this particular piece and publication fits in within a broader project I have about African higher education. So to start off, this presentation comes from a paper that was recently published in Educational Policy Analysis and Archives, which is a peer-reviewed open access publication. So here I've included the citation for anyone who wants to download it. You don't need to log into anything, it's just publicly available. And on here I've listed some of my co-authors who are not able to be with me today, but contributed definitely to this work. These are all PhD students at ASU, except for Atota, who just recently graduated, so he's no longer a student. So even though Earl, Atota, Keti, and Nalakshi can't join us here today, I just want to acknowledge their very hard work on this piece. Additionally, I also want to acknowledge some of the researchers that have been working with me on the broader project from which this paper comes, including Dr. Roseanne Njuru, who's a lecturer at the University of Nairobi, Jocelyn Munuzero, who's a tutorial assistant at Kigali Institute of Science and Technology, Dr. Marie Chantal, who is a lecturer in the University of Rwanda Physics Department and currently working in an advisory role for the Rwandan government, and Dr. Florence, who's an associate professor at Makerere University. This work more broadly would not be possible without the support, collaboration, and tremendous intellectual contributions of these women. So I want to make sure I acknowledge them as well. as well as the students who are not, all of the students who are involved in my research team and on this, on the broader project, if not this paper, including Minji Kim, Catherine, Alexia Roberts, and Martha Kazuza. So I just wanted, yes, like as mentioned, to just give a little bit of acknowledgement to all of those people who have supported this work. So this study is about higher education and policy mandates in Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. And so I just wanted to provide a little bit of sociopolitical context for each study site before I launch into the details of the study. For those of you who may be familiar, Kenya is home to about 51 million people and has one of the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa at a rate, last time I checked, of about 5.7%. And the Kenyan government in recent years has prioritized affordable housing, manufacturing, and universal healthcare, as well as food security as major economic development milestones. It's important to note that in Kenya, women make up less than 30% of graduates from public universities and less than 35% of graduates from STEM programs within higher education. Meanwhile, Rwanda is home to about 12 million people and seeks to become a middle-income country by 2035. This country has an economic growth rate of about 7.5% and a GDP of 9.5 billion. After the Rwandan genocide of 1994, Rwanda has seen improvements of various living standards, including a decline in child mortality and a nearly universal access to primary education. What I have found in my preliminary research for this work is that in higher education settings, public universities and Rwanda are increasingly market focused. And then in Uganda, we know that it has a population of about 42 million people and has a growth rate of about 4.5%. And after recovering from a major armed conflict that ended in 1986, President Museveni has implemented significant public sector investments and structural reforms. We also know that in Ugandan higher education, women tend to drop out disproportionately of higher education, especially within STEM programs. So the STEM pipeline is what some researchers would call very leaky. Here I provide just like an overview, just to summarize the key features of the higher education landscape in all three country settings. So the total number of public universities, we see that Kenya is definitely by far the largest. In each institution, the number of private universities and the total number of institutions, as well as the flagship university, including the University of Nairobi, University of Rwanda, and Makerere University in Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, respectively. Women's enrollment in higher education overall, and we see also a rising trend of increased women's enrollment in private institutions across the board. So in this work, my team and I were led by the following two research questions. One, how do key policy documents conceptualize gender equity? And two, how is gender discussed in relation to economic priorities and sociopolitical realities in these policy documents? So these are the questions that we wanted to answer through our study. Methodologically, we decided to use a critical discourse analysis. As many of you know, most likely, CDAA is a useful method for critiquing education policies. And it's an approach that many scholars have used to critique higher education policies in the past. Fairclough and Wodak, 1997, explained that CDA is a method of interrogating the semiotics of language, especially as they relate to power. Others have shown how CDA rejects the notion of value-free inquiry and instead recognizes that discourse is influenced by social structure and produced in social interaction. So we thought CDA would be helpful because it helps us see what is both said explicitly and unsaid, and what that reveals from an institutional perspective and what that tells us about how gender is understood and enacted in these research settings. We focused on three key documents in our work, including Kenya's Education and Training Gender Policy, Rwanda's Education Strategic Sector Plan from 2018 to 2023, and Uganda's Gender and Education Policy. And in terms of discrete steps, we did two main things. First, my teammates and I read the policies closely and annotated the documents individually based on the following policy frames, including goals, rationale, strategies, outcomes, facts, and statistics. And then second, we conducted an in-depth inductive analysis of our notes, looking for relationships between discourse and our population of interest, which is women. And we analyzed what CDA experts call the microfeatures of language in order to see what is both unsaid and said explicitly about women and gender, right? So are they depicted as passive individuals on whom these policy documents or these policy priorities are forced upon? Are they seen as individuals with agency? Are they seen as a problem to be solved, as a resource to be tapped? These are the sort of areas that we focused on. In terms of our findings, we found we were able, well, first I should say, we were able to access all the 3 policy documents because they're publicly available through UNESCO's website. And in terms of priorities, we found that the policy from, and I'm happy to share my slides as well if that would be easier later. We found that in Kenya, the policy document overall shows how that this the Kenyan government seeks to eliminate all gender disparities in learning environments and education and governance. Meanwhile, the policy document from Rwanda showed that the Rwandan government seeks to increase the quality of higher education and improve levels of education across level, with only one small subsection devoted to gender parity. And from the Uganda's policy document, we see that a focus on efficiency and effectiveness related to gender. In terms of what unifies all 3 documents, we found that in our analysis that we see that governments are acknowledging the harms of gender-based violence. They express a keen interest in regional and global engagement and the spillover effects, and they highlight the spillover effects of gender inequity on economic development and the labor market, right? We need to make sure women are participating in secondary and higher education because they're major players and are an untapped resource for economic competitiveness. In terms of the differences that we've noticed between the 3 documents, we can summarize our findings as the document from Kenya showing a reproduction of power, essentially a desire to maintain and reproduce the status quo as it relates to gender norms and the participation and the role of women. In Rwanda, we see evidence of maintenance of power through this policy document, and in the Ugandan gender policy, we see an evasion of power by really focusing on efficiency and effectiveness and not really tackling the issues of gender and gender-based discrimination head on. We believe that this work is really important, and then the findings from this work are important because of the espoused priorities from each country. So in the Kenyan setting, we know that Kenya has been trying to implement gender policies in the education sector since 2007. But many scholars, particularly critical ones, are hesitant about the implementation and the feasibility of achieving these results, especially in STEM higher education. So keeping the extant literature in mind, as well as our own findings from the CDA, we believe that the gender policy in education should specifically focus on the gender gap in STEM higher education settings, as it remains the area with the largest gender disparity in favor of male students. Meanwhile, our findings from the CDA in the Rwandan context has been focused on gender-related policymaking since we found that the Rwandan government has been focused on gender-related policymaking since the 1994 genocide. And we recognize how this government has made great strides and continues to do so as it relates to this. However, we believe that what is most important is the understanding that all policies relating to work and society must integrate gender-based strategies to create structural changes within institutions of higher education, as well as challenge and change gender-based perceptions and stereotypes in broader Rwandan society. And then the results of our analysis compel us in the Ugandan context to consider how Uganda's gender policy is really limited to numerically oriented gender issues, such as disparity enrollment ratio and graduation rate. So based on our CDA, on this idea of evasion of power that we found evidence of, we believe that the Rwandan government needs to be more comprehensive in gender issue analysis by including both qualitative experiences of minoritized populations, such as women in higher education, as well as an analysis of structural gender issues. So when we zoom out a little bit more, we think that this work is really important because, as stated in the policy documents pretty explicitly, women's participation in the workforce is a necessary component and a precursor for economic prosperity for each of the three countries discussed in this paper. Over the past 50 years, we've seen how educational attainment accounts for about 50% of economic growth. And so while we see how gender equality or equity has not been reached for the majority of women in these countries, economic development and prosperity will continue to be stalled until the entire eligible workforce is engaged in higher education. Additionally, we believe that our work matters because it draws attention to policy deficiencies with respect to clearly identifying gender-based issues in education and clear and effective strategies to address these issues head-on. And overall, we think that our use of CDA was fitting as a methodological approach and for undertaking an examination of how gender-based issues in education are often addressed in superficial and vague ways, right? So our idea here is that oftentimes, whether it's governments or higher education institutions themselves, they're writing, disseminating, and enacting these policies more so to check boxes than to authentically address real inequities related to gender. So keeping that in mind, I just want to place this study in this larger project I'm trying to do about higher education on the African continent. And that can be summarized really in three major components. Part one is this discourse involves sort of the groundwork that I've done, including this paper which has been published in EPAA of our discourse analysis of policy documents, as well as an extensive annotated bibliography that my students have assisted me with research, existing research and literature about women in African higher education with a focus on STEM higher education. So we have the annotated bibliography and the discourse analysis from which this paper came from in part one. Part two involves a pilot study at student experiences at public universities in East Africa, including the ones I mentioned, the flagship institutions that I mentioned, which are University of Nairobi, University of Rwanda, and Makerere University. And for that, I've received a institutional grant from the Institute of Social Science Research at ASU to help me conduct pilot work involving 150 survey responses and 20 interviews per campus, so 60 interviews total of women who are currently enrolled in undergraduate engineering programs at these three institutions. And then building on that work, I just recently received funding to study faculty perceptions of teaching and learning environments at private universities in, again, Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda because of the rising number of private institutions in this region, as well as the access gap they seem to be filling, right? So as many of you know, private universities in these countries tend to be better resourced and more prestigious, and therefore are considered very elite and are often inaccessible to historically marginalized populations. Women, and especially women who live at the intersection of multiple marginalities, right? So poor women, women from geographically underserved regions, women who may be have had limited resources when they were attending their secondary and primary institutions. And so when women who are disadvantaged are not able to access those well-resourced public universities, like the flagship institutions that are in part two of this work, they often turn to private institutions. Now, I have an inkling from existing research and just from my own work that I've also done in Ethiopia, private universities, that there are things worth investigating more closely. I think a closer examination is needed to ensure that these universities are not necessarily taking advantage of these students who who don't have a ton of access elsewhere. So that's how this work fits into my larger research agenda and project. All the while, at every stage, I really try to acknowledge, collaborate, and work reciprocally with colleagues on the African continent. I'm Ethiopian American myself, and I have this, what Patricia Hill Collins calls an insider-outsider perspective, because although I have a cultural and definitely historical connection through my family and my lineage to Ethiopia and Ethiopian culture, and by extension, African institutions. I live in the United States. I'm a US citizen. I work at a US institution. And every time I've gone back to Ethiopia to do any sort of research, I always do it on behalf of an American institution. And so keeping that in mind, I think my positionality is largely Western in a research context. And I want to be conscious that I'm working in a way that's useful. I'm engaging in projects in a way that's useful to my colleagues and collaborators. And I do that because of just sort of my own personal commitments to this kind of research, and also largely because of this quote in a speech by Ndlovu Gatsheni, who is a South African academic. So in his work, he says, this marginalization of African scholarship is sustained by a deliberate, uneven division of intellectual labor rooted in imperialism and colonialism, in which scholars of Africa and the rest of the global South have been reduced to hunter-gatherers of raw data that is turned into theories in the global North. And this is something I come back to often because I think many people that I know, whether intentionally or unintentionally, are guilty of this, right? So you have this really great grant, you go collaborate with colleagues in emerging market contexts. They're super nice, they're welcoming, they help you, they serve as cultural institutional liaisons to help you get your data. And then you leave, go back stateside or to Europe or wherever you happen to live, publish your manuscripts, and never really make them equal stakeholders in this work. And that's something I think is really troubling, and I try not to engage in it myself. And so at each turn, I'm trying to make sure that I'm giving, I'm providing space for my collaborators to be meaningful stakeholders in this work. With that, I will just want to acknowledge the funders for this work, including the Institute of Social Science Research at Arizona State University and the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellowship program, which is allowing me to do part 3 of this project, and my contact information, including my email and my personal portfolio. So with that, I will pause and hopefully be able to engage with the audience both online and in person for any questions or feedback you may have. Sure, I'll let you. Let's see if this is ours. All right, so I'm going to start sharing.